Okay, let's assume that everything, let's say that I grant every single thing you're saying. Can you think of a more protectionist, more socialist, more authoritarian or fascist economic policy than Donald Trump buying golden shares in US companies?
Hey everyone, welcome back. Genuinely glad you are here for this one because this might be one of the most interesting economic arguments I have seen play out in a long time. So, what you are about to watch is Jake and Steven going head to head on a question that sounds simple on the surface but gets surprisingly deep, really fast. We are talking about free markets, government investment, green energy, and whether the policies being defended actually hold up when you point them at real-world decisions. And I will say this much. One of these two men says something in this conversation that completely contradicts everything he spent the last hour arguing, and he admits it out loud. Trust me, you want to stay until that moment because it genuinely changes how the whole debate lands. Also, before we get into it, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching from right now. It always blows me away seeing how far this community reaches, so say hello down there. Alright, let us get into it.
Would abandon that field completely.
You abandon that field completely because you don't actually need to have the subsidy to incentivize the creation if you allow for the profit incentive to work. If you cut the taxes, if you don't have things like Sherman Antitrust Act that are ultimately going to strip away the efficiency that gets developed by creating something, like when you have a field that has an intensely high cost of entry, once you get there, you get an intense amount of money. But that's because you often can have an oligopolist or a near monopolist control over that field. And when you try to, at least at the beginning, until it becomes more and more ubiquitous, when you have all these government regulations insisting that we can't allow that, now you have to, because you have one government policy which dismantles the society, dismantles the economy, changes the market, you then have to fix that problem by inserting a new kind of subsidy, which is then going to warp it further. It's a
Well,
government cycle of causing more disaster.
Yeah, it is warping, but the warping here we're trying to get is an investment in green energy with the idea that in the future, hopefully the costs of manufacturing it will go down, which they have. But you want to be on the forefront of developing that rather than waiting for the rest of the world to develop it and then just having to import from other people because now they all subsidized it early on to make early investments in it. And now they're reaping the rewards of having the manufacturing, the production, and the know-how for how to deploy it. Why would we wait to be late to the game on that because we are against subsidies or something?
Because your subsidy is always going to redistribute wealth from something that you think it's going to take a small amount of wealth from a huge number of spaces and insert it into a space that you like as a high level, almost godly like figure think it works. But the central planning never ever ends up in better outcomes. And the reason that people think it comes up in better outcomes is because you have the entire field gets a very small reduction in their ability to have a very visible benefit in one field. And that net impact comes out worse. You end up developing an economic wedge in your market and creating an inefficiency.
Do you think that the atomic bomb subsidies and all the research and the subsidies for splitting the atom were a mistake in the United States? Should we have waited for the free market to solve that?
I think when you're in a war-like situation is a potential exception for the idea that we need to have this for war.
You don't think that having
Although
your
I'm
own
not
independent
entirely
energy
convinced
grids?
that's true. And I'm frankly undecided back and forth on whether things like subsidies for the atomic bomb would have been necessary.
You don't think you can ever subsidize your way ahead of an opponent?
I think the only time that would be worthwhile to do that would be when you're in an active war situation where lives are actively at stake if you don't get there.
Couldn't there be perverse incentives to where you're constantly incentivized to make these short-term investments because you're just always going to be getting paid more, but there might be like a long-term investment that if you could endure the long-term investment, eventually you're going to surpass whatever revenues or profits you would have made by doing the long-term
No,
investment?
these incentives do not exist because the long term, the players who take the long term strategy win in the long term. These incentives
But
might
they have to
appear to
remain
exist in the short
solvent. They have
term,
to
but they
remain
lose long
solvent.
term.
You don't know that. They have to be solvent in the long term. There might be a whole bunch of other coordinated industries as well. It might be that you could make some investment in green energy that would pay back in 15 or 20 years, but what individual actor is going to make that investment? You might not find a person who's willing to back you with that much capital. And there might also need to be public coordination that goes along with that as well, because you got to be able to connect into public energy grids that may or not be able to support the type of energy that you want to transfer along the grid. Like, Like, do you think China's making a mistake right now with their massive investments in green energy? Has that been a misstep and a
Yes.
misplay by
I
China?
think that the fascist redistribution of wealth that happens in China for these purposes. I'm an Austrian economics person. I believe strongly in allowing for the market to find the most efficient usage of wealth, and I think that China is reducing their ability to develop in other places, and they're becoming extremely developed in the thing that they are focusing extremely hard on. And their people are getting more wealthy as they get more capitalist. But overall, the people of China are still very poor, especially in West China. And a lot of the abilities to create some of these developments are the product of using extraction of this wealth out of West China. Like, this is the
Uh,
problem.
I
Whenever
can't.
you
I mean, like, I
spend
understand what you're
money in
saying.
one
What you're
place,
saying,
you have to take it from others.
Here is what gets me every single time this conversation comes up. The free market argument sounds clean on paper. It really does. Cut the taxes, remove the regulations, let the profit motive do its thing, and somehow the most important industries in the world will magically build themselves. Stephen made this point, and I think it is one of the most underrated observations in this entire exchange. He said this: you want to be on the forefront of developing that rather than waiting for the rest of the world to develop it and then just having to import from other people. That is not a left-wing talking point. That is basic strategic thinking. And here is what people do not realize about the energy market specifically. This is not like launching a food delivery app. You are not competing in a space where 10 companies can test ideas with small budgets and see what sticks. Energy infrastructure requires massive upfront capital, government licensing, grid integration, and long-term planning that goes decades out. The free market is genuinely not built to optimize for that timeline in most cases. Jake kept falling back on Austrian economics, and I want to be clear, that framework has real intellectual value in many contexts. But when Jake said he believes strongly in allowing the market to find the most efficient usage of wealth, that sounds convincing until you apply it to an industry where the barriers to entry are so high that most private actors will simply never show up. You cannot wait for someone to organically decide to build the next generation energy grid the same way someone decided to build a better search engine. The part that genuinely blew my mind was when Jake started talking about how subsidies always redistribute wealth in ways that create inefficiency. And yes, that can be true. But you have to understand, that exact logic would have killed the semiconductor industry before it started. It would have killed commercial aviation. These are industries that required public investment to reach the scale where private competition could actually take over and thrive.
I understand that, but like I mean, like we just have this would be an impasse, but like the entire field, I'm pretty sure even if we found some Austrian economists, they would disagree with you. There are things that you could make investments into that for a variety of reasons, the free market might not be capable of making investments into, especially when we're talking about energy markets, which are largely government kind of approved anyway, right? Like the infrastructure publicly is usually ran by or owned by a single entity because it wouldn't make sense to duplicate the infrastructure. The cost of entry is incredibly high, and the greater the barriers there are to entry into a market, the less likely there is to be good competition or innovation in that market. Energy sources themselves are usually owned by governments. I don't know if like a private owner, it's not like the gold rush or the oil rush of the 1800s. I don't know when the fuck people were going to California looking for gold or oil. Like, it's not like we can just do that. So all of these things are licensed by the government anyway. Like, I just don't think this is a great area where the free market can just come in and magically solve for things. I think we probably have to be a little bit more forward thinking, especially when you're thinking all of our energy markets are already heavily subsidized anyway. So I don't even know where
And
green
that
energy
shouldn't
would come
happen.
in.
That's what we're talking about, is not subsidizing those energy markets anymore.
Don't you think it might be important to ensure some level of stability in those energy markets for national security purposes? That like letting some of those
No, I
markets.
think that there's an extreme incentive to be the financial company that is providing that balance. And I think the fact that there is a difficult barrier to entry
Wait, why do you think
allows
that?
for the company that does ultimately end up entering it to have a monopolistic or near monopolistic ability to then generate not just to generate actual economic profit. And so the incentive for the 10, 20 long year investment term, I mean, people buy, 20-year bonds and stuff. Like, the idea that like people aren't going to make an investment because it's really far away is just not the truth. And in fact, the people who are
Hold on,
extremely wealthy are
wait. Why are
looking
you
for these
saying
unicorns.
20-year bonds are literally guaranteed? This is almost like a cash equivalent investment. That like this is not the same thing as a risky investment into a new alternative energy type that may or may not be supported in the future.
No,
I mean,
that's
like
true.
subsidies are powerful things that allow you to control markets. There's a reason why when we negotiate trade deals, real ones, not these weird tariff ones, why when you negotiate trade deals, part of those trade deals are regulating the subsidy markets in other countries. Like
Yeah, I think
these are
that's
very
absurd. I don't see any reason to, like, if Germany wants to subsidize a particular field where then they are taxing their own citizens to pay for the development of something that we can then use, I support that fully. I have zero objection ever to another country taxing their citizens to invent products that I can then use.
You can say that, but there are times when, as much as I might not like it, even protectionist trade policy can be highly beneficial. There are huge investments that Taiwan made in their semiconductor manufacturing industry, and it's the only reason why anybody in the world even gives a fuck about the island. The World War II, post-World War II Japanese economy was highly protectionist, and it helped them grow an entire field of electronics that were highly competitive and sometimes superior to the rest of the world. I mean, there are times when protecting certain markets can be beneficial because you can't always be able to compete with the rest of the world market at every single point in time. Yeah, I mean, if you're just going to take a
These are
position of, like,
places of countries that had been under non-capitalist systems who were suddenly under semi-fascist, mostly capitalist systems. The economic booms that happened in both Taiwan and Japan are not the product of their government interventions. They're the product of the reduction of government interventions when you're losing Hirohitoism and when Chiang Kai-shek and the fascists in China are escaping mainland China to then go and form a mostly capitalist country in Taiwan.
This is the part of the conversation where Stephen laid a trap and Jake walked straight into it without realizing it until it was already too late. Stephen asked directly, "Do you think China is making a mistake right now with their massive investments in green energy? Has that been a misstep by China?" And watch what happens when Jake answers that. Instead of defending his free market position cleanly, he pivots to calling China's economic model fascist redistribution. Which, okay, you can make that argument. But that is not an answer to the question. The question was about results, and the results are not ambiguous at this point. China now manufactures more solar panels than the rest of the world combined. They dominate battery production. They are leading on electric vehicle exports, whatever you think about how they got there. And the outcome is real, and it is affecting American industry right now. Dismissing that as just the product of wealth extraction does not make the competitive gap disappear. And then came the moment that I think revealed everything. Jake said this: "If Germany wants to subsidize a particular field, I support that fully. I have zero objection ever to another country taxing their citizens to invent products that I can then use." Read that back slowly. He is literally saying he is fine with other countries subsidizing their industries and then selling those products to Americans. He just does not want America to do it for itself. Think about what that actually means strategically. You are essentially arguing that the United States should be comfortable being the customer while everyone else becomes the manufacturer. This is where the ideology starts to collapse under its own weight, because at some point pure theory has to meet real-world competition. And when your competitors are playing a completely different game, insisting on a purist approach is not principled. It is just falling behind while calling it a virtue.
okay, let's assume that let's say that I grant every single thing you're saying. Can you think of a more protectionist, more socialist, more authoritarian or fascist economic policy than Donald Trump buying golden shares in US companies?
Oh no, I think that was one of the worst. I will
Okay, so
fully
then in that
cave to you
case,
that is
sure.
that's something that Harris would not have done.
Then
That might
for
be
whatever
the
we care about the
best
Green New
argument
Deal,
against
then
Donald Trump.
yeah, so then whatever you care about the Green New Deal, Trump is worse on this than Harris would have been.
No, that's definitely not the case.
But
Because
do you think Harris? Wait, do you agree with the tariffs, the worldwide tariffs on every single country on the planet?
no, but I don't agree with those because those are taxes. And the Donald Trump did push for the 2017 tax cut, so that's basically a wash. The economic development that we saw
How
under
is that
Trump
a
won,
wash?
because if we didn't have Trump right now, then the 2017 tax cuts would have expired.
Okay. Do you think the
And
tariffs are
so then
better
we
than the
would have
tax cuts?
added back those taxes. And so the tariffs are a tax, which I do not like. And the
Yeah, but if you
2017
want to talk
tax
about,
cuts is a
well,
tax
if you
cut,
want to
which I
talk
do
about,
like.
if you want to talk about market distortionary effects, what do you think is more market ruinous, the tariffs or taxes? Like
Tariffs
progressive
are
income tax
taxes.
brackets.
Tariffs
No, no, no,
have,
no,
so the
stop, stop,
problem,
stop.
the thing
Tariffs
about,
do not. Tariffs are not overlaid on the market. They are. Hold on. Do you believe that a income tax is as market distortionary as a tariff?
an income tax is not going to distort an individual market as much. It is going to distort the US economy similarly.
Similarly,
Yes. Because what happens with
isn't
the
most of the
tariff,
spending isn't most of the spending and everything that's done in the U.S. done by businesses and commercial stuff anyway? That's all going to be written off as part of tax expenditure, as part of like non-tax stuff. It's going to be part of the expense of doing business regardless. Are the income taxes here really heavily distorting the market in the same way that tariffs are? That's causing a shift of who knows what all across the entire world, where it's just a raw tax that all these
yeah, so when you talk
producers
about
have to eat?
distorting of the market, it's not that the tariffs shift wealth from one industry to another industry by taxing a particular industry higher or less. And so they do have a different distribution of it, and that is a problem. But the income taxes end up just taxing benefits. They end up taxing income. They end up taxing the idea of productivity altogether, and they end up increasing the amount of leisure rather than the amount of consumption hours that any person is selecting towards. I mean, this is your basic Laffer curve idea of reducing your productivity by increasing the taxes. And so the tariffs are going to distort the market by shifting power from one place to another place, or sorry, shifting money from one place to another place in ways that they shouldn't do, in ways that are bad, in ways that I oppose. An income tax is going to shift the amount of labor and effort and all kinds of things that people put in favor of not paying that tax.
So one, I'm not fully convinced. Two, Laffer curve has to do with what's your optimal rate of taxation to balance the percentage taxation you have with the amount of income that you collect. So
right, but the reason that works is because when you increase the taxes, you decrease the productivity.
Sure, we can make that argument, but what is our evidence that when we look at like the tariffs versus the income taxes, why are we assuming that like boil this down into a real world example of like when is an American trying to earn less money because of like an income tax?
Oh, the moment Stephen said this, can you think of a more protectionist, more socialist, more authoritarian or fascist economic policy than a leader buying golden shares in companies? That was not a question. That was a wall closing in, because the entire conversation up to that point had Jake defending free market principles as if they were sacred. Every subsidy is bad. Every government intervention warps the market. Central planning never produces good outcomes. He said all of that, passionately, repeatedly. And then Stephen just pointed at the actual policy record and asked Jake to square those two things, and Jake could not. He said, "I will fully cave to you." That is something Harris would not have done. That is the concession that matters most in this entire debate, not because it is about one policy, but because it exposes the gap between what people say they believe and what they are actually willing to defend when it is their own side doing it. Here is what this moment teaches us about political identity, and I think this is something worth sitting with. When someone spends an hour arguing that government intervention in markets is always destructive, and then the very leader they supported goes further than almost any modern Western government in directly buying equity stakes in private companies, and the response is just, "I will cave on that point but still support him overall," that tells you the ideology was never really the thing driving the support. The ideology was the justification, and justifications bend when loyalty is involved. Stephen did not even need to go hard on this. He just asked a clean question, and the answer said everything. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.